Okay, let's start then, and welcome everybody to this second in the Cambridge Historic Churches Trust series of online lectures. And before I say anything else, this will be recorded. I hope you're all content with that, but the recording will not include the visual shots of you all who are participating, but the lecture and the comments will be recorded. Now, many of you, I think, are not members of Cambridge Historic Churches Trust, so for your benefit, the Trust exists to give loans and grants to help church congregations with the cost of repairs and improvements like kitchens and lavatories that make the church buildings more usable both to the congregations themselves and to the wider community. And they are particularly pressed for funds at the moment, of course, because of COVID and not being able to hold many of the fundraising events which they usually rely on to raise money from the wider community as well as from the congregation to enable them to keep going, because of course they have to pay not just the cost of their clergy but all their other running expenses as well. So if you're not already a member, we'd be delighted if you joined us, and you can do that very easily on the website. And anyway, if you aren't a member and you have attended this evening's lecture, which I'm sure you will have enjoyed immensely, please do consider donating to the Trust Fund, which you can also do very readily on the website. Now, as we normally, as well as our work of financial assistance to churches, we do run conferences and tours of churches and other events. And this year, of course, and most of last year, we were unable to do so. And therefore, we are relying, like many other organisations, on online events. But of course, the upside of that is that enables us to reach a wider audience than we have previously. So it's an ill wind, isn't it? This series of lectures is about churches' towers and spires and the things that you find on them. Because they are the most prominent feature, really, of our churches, both visibly and audibly. And of course, among their contents, as we should be thinking about tonight, there are those things which are to do with timekeeping and sundials. I suppose we're cheating slightly because sundials aren't always on the tower, are they? But they could be somewhere else. But I think that is within the spirit of our series of lectures. So before I actually introduce our speaker tonight, a couple of technical things. If you have questions which you would like to put to our speaker, could you type those into chat, which you'll find you can click on the bottom of your screen, and then you type in, I think on most devices you'll find that you have to type in at the bottom of the panel, but anyway, that's how you can put in questions during the talk if you like, or at the end, and then we'll select those. If we have a lot of questions, obviously we can't ask our speaker to answer them all necessarily, but we will select as many as we can for him to answer. So tonight we are privileged to have as our speaker Dr. Frank King. He's a fellow in computer science at Churchill College, Cambridge, and latterly he's become very deservedly well known for his wealth of knowledge on the subject of tonight's lecture. He's currently chairman of the British Sundial Society, and he's designed a number of notable sundials at Pembroke, Selwyn and Newnham colleges in Cambridge, and in Old Palace Yard outside the House of Lords in London, as well as the moon mark on the new London Stock Exchange. And so, Dr. King, we await hearing the benefit of your wisdom and knowledge on sundials and prayer times.
The title of this talk is Sundials and Prayer Times, and I have a subtitle: Check for Sun, then say your prayers. And if you think this is a rather strange thing to write, then let's re-express it in a modern way as an algorithm. Step 1, note the position of the sun. Step 2, if the position is appropriate, then say your prayers. Step 3, wait. Step 4, repeat from 1. I seem to have gone from the unlikely to the unbelievable. And yet, the 3 great Abrahamic traditions, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, all have traditions of saying prayers at times governed by this algorithm. The Muslims are well known to this day for saying prayers 5 times a day. Well, those 5 times are still governed by this algorithm. To be sure, the algorithm is a little short on detail. Just what do I mean by the position of the sun being appropriate? Well, we shall see. But first, there are a couple of snags to deal with. And the first is that it is very dangerous to look directly at the sun, and instead, traditionally, people made use of a sundial. The general idea is that you make inferences about the position of the sun by studying the shadows on the sundial. Now, of course, you may say, I don't recall any of my Muslim friends consulting a sundial before going off to pray. Well, that is probably true, because these days, many Muslims use a prayer time app on their mobile telephones. And these will tell you the 5 times for praying and tell you the direction of Mecca. But there are 2 snags. The other is that you can't use what I'm calling an ordinary sundial, the kind you see in churchyards and on the walls of churches. You have instead to make use of what I am calling an old style sundial. But before I can describe an old style sundial, I first have to explain the old style way of thinking about time itself. To this end, I am going to go back around 2000 years to the heyday of imperial Rome, and of course, the early years of the Christian era. Now, in Roman times, people distinguished between 2 kinds of day. One they referred to as the dies naturalis, the natural day, and the other as dies civilis, the civil day. And the civil day is very much as we ourselves understand it. Roughly speaking, 1 Earth rotation divided into 24 equal parts called hours, and a reference point, midnight, where one day ends and the next day begins, and that's where the Romans changed the date, and it is also where we change the date. All that said, very few people in ancient Rome thought in terms of the civil day. They thought in terms of the natural day, which is altogether different. Here, the principal division is quite simply distinguishing between day and night. Day is the period from sunrise to sunset, and night is the period from sunset to the following sunrise. And both these periods were separately divided into 12 parts, still called hours. Now, it's not difficult to see why this is called a natural day. Human beings are, by nature, creatures of the day, and before the advent of artificial light, once it became too dark to see, then there was very little for it but to go to sleep. Now, if you are going to divide the daylight period into 12 parts, you will note that in summer, when the days are long, that your hours are going to be long during the day, but short during the night. And it's the other way around in winter. And in consequence, this way of thinking about the day has come to be known as using unequal hours. The hours keep changing length from one day to the next through the year, in contrast to what we're accustomed to, every hour being the same length. Now, the system of using unequal hours goes by other names. Sometimes it's referred to as using seasonal hours. The hours vary with the season. And yet others refer to the scheme as using Jewish hours. This was the time scheme used by the ancient Jews, and in particular for timetabling their prayers. Well, if we're going to design a sundial which divides the daylight period into 12 parts, we find we have to use a sundial which is somewhat different from what we're accustomed to. The Romans had a variety of designs to choose from, but rather than describing an ancient Roman sundial, I want to describe the kind of sundial which was in widespread use in medieval Europe and in medieval England in particular. And the best way of understanding a sundial is to imagine making one. So let's suppose this diagram represents a vertical wall abutting a horizontal pavement. And importantly, I want this wall to face due south. That means I can mark a north pointer on the pavement, knowing that it will be perpendicular to the foot of the wall. Now, the most important component of most sundials is the gnomon. That comes from the Greek word nomos, meaning pointer or indicator. And you may have seen a sundial with a gnomon looking something like this. Here I am imagining a rod or a pole leaning against the wall, and it will make an angle to the horizontal matching the local latitude. And what we have here is the outline of what I've called an ordinary sundial, but this is not suitable for dividing the daylight period into 12 parts. Instead, I need to have the gnomon mounted horizontally. It is horizontal and aligned north-south. Now, the goal is to mark hour lines on the wall, indicating where the shadow of this gnomon is during the course of the day from sunrise to sunset. Let's start at sunrise. Now, we know that the sun is at least vaguely in the east, that's to the right. We also know it's on the horizon. And so the sun is on the same horizontal level as this horizontal gnomon, and we will get a horizontal shadow to the left, that's to the west. I've drawn a long shadow suggesting that the sun is almost in line with the wall, but in the depths of winter, the sun can rise at some way to the south of due east, and we will get a shorter shadow. But the important thing is that at sunrise, the shadow is horizontal, so I can mark a horizontal hour line, knowing that if the shadow falls on this line, it is sunrise. And I can mark a matching line for sunset on the other side. Now, of all the positions that the sun can take up in the sky, the most important is probably sunset. The ancient Jews, and indeed the present Jews and the present Muslims, regard sunset as the end of one day and the beginning of the next. That's when they change the dates on the Jewish calendar and the Muslim calendar. And both Jews and Muslims have prayers at sunset. I don't think the date changed at midnight, changed at sunset in England, but it certainly changed at sunset in medieval Italy. So even the Christians have a tradition of changing the date at sunset. By contrast, I've said almost nothing about sunrise, and in terms of prayer times, this is rather less important. The Jews and the Christians historically do have prayers associated with sunrise, but somewhat curiously, the Muslims are actually prohibited from saying prayers at sunrise. They're not allowed to pray until the sun has reached 1 spear's height above the horizon. Well, we've marked sunrise and sunset. The next obvious line to mark is one for midday. Midday by the sun is defined as when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, and in British latitude, it's always due south. And given that the gnomon is aligned north-south, then the shadow will be vertical. So let's mark a vertical line on the wall for midday. And all 3 religions have prayers at midday. Well, the next division is to think of marking mid-morning. And here there is a little bit of a problem. In medieval Europe, medieval England, the midday hour line was marked at 45 degrees. And certainly this is halfway between horizontal and vertical. But unfortunately, equal angles don't translate into equal intervals of time. And this isn't actually in the right place. But nobody seemed to bother. And indeed, there is no really good reason why they should. Suppose you and I agree to meet tomorrow in some place, and we agree to meet at mid-morning. Well, if we both use this kind of sundial, we'll get to that place at the same time, and it will be very little interest to either of us that we're actually meeting somewhat after mid-morning. Well, in like manner, there was another 45-degree marking mid-afternoon. And at this stage, I have 5 hour lines partitioning the daylight period into 4 nominal quarters. And this way of thinking about the daylight period was in use for thousands of years. The ancient Babylonians thought in terms of dividing the day in this way. And the ancient Jews, who had a troubled relationship with the Babylonians, used these 5 times as times for prayer. And these 5 times were copied by the early Christians as times for the 5 daytime Christian offices. Fast forward to the present day, and you can think in terms of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, with 2 coffee breaks thrown in mid-morning and mid-afternoon. Maybe this really is the natural way of thinking about the day. In ancient Rome, the Roman army treated these 4 periods as watches, and there were 4 more watches during the night. So these 5 times were times for changing watch in the Roman army. In the city of Rome, at midday, officials would go through the streets, ringing bells or banging gongs so people would know that it was midday. And some writers suggest that this practice was also followed at mid-morning and mid-afternoon. Well, so important historically is this pattern of lines that you do occasionally on medieval churches in England find this pattern of lines dressed up as a sundial. I can't find an example of an ancient sundial like this in Cambridgeshire, but I can show you a reconstructed modern example. And here we are in the churchyard of Wadham Church in South Cambridgeshire. And clearly we are looking at a headstone. Well, you can see the 5 lines quite clearly, and you can see they have been ornamented a little by wrapping them up in an enclosing circle. And this wrapping up with an enclosing circle is quite commonly found on medieval sundials. But the 3 labels you might be able to make out here, sunrise, noon, and sunset, are definitely not something you'll see on ancient sundials. Both sides of this headstone were cut by the Cardozo Kindersley workshop in Cambridge, and I have worked with this workshop for over 40 years. And when I first heard about this sundial, I was both intrigued and a little concerned. Christian graves tend to be aligned west-east, and I could see this sundial ending up facing due west, when the whole design depends upon it facing due south. This sundial looked as though it wasn't going to work. But there was a saving grace. It turns out that the graves in Wadham churchyard are not aligned quite west-east. And this side of the stone, it turns out, faces about 17 degrees south of due west. And that's important because it means this side of the stone will see the sun from quite some time before midday and then all the way through the rest of the day. And it's obviously no use equipping this with a gnomon that is perpendicular to the dial. But if I were to mount a gnomon that was horizontal and 17 degrees to the face of a stone, then it would be aligned north-south, and at midday, I should get a vertical shadow. So equipped with a knitting needle, I went along to Wadham and held the knitting needle so that it's horizontal and 17 degrees to the face of the stone, and set my camera to take this photograph at almost exactly midday by the sun, and you can see I have a vertical shadow. It's rather a wiggly shadow, but that's largely because of the irregularities in the surface of the stone. If I'd been patient enough to keep the knitting needle in this position for the rest of the day, then at some stage in the afternoon, the shadow would have fallen on the nominal mid-afternoon hour line, but not exactly at mid-afternoon. But at sunset, it really should fall on the sunset hour line. Sadly, it won't, but that's because there are too many trees to the west of this sundial. Well, back to my diagram. The goal is to have the daylight period divided into 12 parts. So each of these 4 parts needs dividing into 3 subparts. So for the first half of the morning, I'm going to add 2 hour lines at 15-degree intervals. And 3 15s makes 45. Likewise for the second half of the morning and the afternoon. So I end up with 13 hour lines partitioning the daylight period into 12 parts, nominally 1 hour periods. And this pattern of lines one quite frequently finds on old churches. And at last I can show you an example on a historic church in Cambridgeshire, indeed in Cambridge itself. And here it is. Complete with the enclosing circle, which I described as a common form of ornamentation, but otherwise this is pretty bereft of ornamentation. Now we are looking at a south buttress on the church that I call the Church of St. Peter without Trumpington Gate. That was the name when this sundial was marked out, but it later swapped names with the college next door, and this is now known as Little St. Mary's. And it will have immediately struck you that this is clearly not the work of a master stonemason. And this seems to be the kind of quality of workmanship that is very commonly found on this kind of sundial. Importantly, the hour lines don't properly radiate from the center, and that is very bad news on a sundial. You'll also note that the gnomon is missing. Originally, it would have been some kind of wooden peg, perhaps replaced several times. Eventually, someone decided to have an iron gnomon set in lead, but that snapped off, and all we're left with is a rusty stump. Now we're looking at this stone, this sundial, square on. So let's go back to my diagram, but to a squared on view. I should perhaps note that this kind of sundial is often referred to as a scratch dial, something roughly scratched on a church wall. the preferred name is to call it a mass dial. Now, I use mass in the pre-Reformation Roman Catholic sense of mass, a term for worship. Now, although this kind of sundial is generally fairly bereft of ornamentation, apart from the enclosing circle, I, for discussion purposes, need to add some numbers. Now, I could label the hour lines. That's what we're used to on analog clocks and watches. But instead, I'm going to number the spaces. What I've done is to number the nominal 1 hour periods from 1 to 12. And it is important that you should think of these as ordinals, not cardinals. That is to say, we talk about the third hour, the 1 hour period, ending in this case at mid-morning. This term is used in two ways. Sometimes at the third hour means at the end of the third hour, in this case, mid-morning itself. So you have to be careful in your interpretation. This way of thinking about the day was in use in England well into the 17th century. Shakespeare used ordinals for referring to time, and ordinals are also used, importantly, in the King James translation of the Bible. Here is an example from the Gospel according to St. Mark. And it was the third hour, and they crucified him. Another example, this from the Gospel reading appointed for Palm Sunday, St. Matthew. Now from the 6th hour, there was darkness over all the land, unto the 9th hour. Now, it should be said that the more you study prayer times, the more you are in receipt of mixed messages. And let me illustrate this by introducing Hippolytus of Rome. Hippolytus was an early writer on the subject of Christian prayer times, and he asserted, at least implicitly, that the 3 references noted in these 2 verses refer to the ends of the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours. And I won't quibble with him there. This, as I've said, was a commonly used interpretation of this way of writing. Hippolytus also asserts that it is because these 3 times are noted here in the story of the crucifixion that 3 of the Christian offices were observed at those times. Whereas other writers suggest that the times of all the Christian offices, at least early on, were straightforwardly copied from established Jewish practice of the day. Well, back to my diagram, it does at least seem that all parties agree that the ends of the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours are special. And occasionally one comes across a sundial on a medieval church looking very much like this, but with the 3 relevant hour lines highlighted with crossbars, forming, of course, 3 Christian crosses. Clearly, this is suggesting these lines are special. But whether it is just noting that these are the times of the 3 of the daytime Christian offices, or whether it is alluding to the 3 times mentioned in the story of the crucifixion, is less clear. On this one, I'm probably going to side with Hippolytus. Well, at this point, I'm going to backtrack on what I did earlier and label the hour lines. As I said, this is what we're used to. And here, the numbers are definitely cardinals. The number 9, for example, labels the hour line, which represents exactly 9 hours after sunrise. And one can readily extend this language to say 9 1/4 hours after sunrise, and so on. I didn't use this system of labeling earlier, principally because it doesn't reflect the biblical use of ordinals. But there is another reason hinted at by the absence of 12 against sunset. I haven't marked the number 12 against sunset because I couldn't mark a matching 0 against sunrise. I'm using Roman numerals, which doesn't have a symbol for 0. Moreover, the very notion of 0 wasn't known in Europe until over 1,000 years into the Christian era. So it's probably best to label those two lines, sunrise and sunset. Well, sunrise and sunset, together with the 3 times here highlighted with crosses, are the times of the 5 daytime Christian offices. And these, if the earlier writers were correct, were times copied across from previous Jewish practice. Now, we have a very elegant geometric pattern here, nicely symmetric, with prayer times every 3 hours through the day. But an obvious question is posed: how is it that the Jews came to have 5 prayer times during the day? They clearly weren't getting guidance from the New Testament. Well, it seems they got their guidance from the Old Testament, and particularly from the Psalms, and very particularly from Psalm 119, where it says, "Oh, 7 times a day do I praise thee. I seem to be 2 prayer times short. And how can I fit in 2 extra prayer times without spoiling this elegant pattern?" And the answer lies in reinterpreting the understanding of the word day to include the 2 periods of twilight after sunset and before sunrise. So I'm going to mark in 2 extra lines. The line on the right, as understood by the ancients, represents the onset of total darkness after the end of the twilight period following sunset. The line on the left represents the end of a period of total darkness just before first light in the twilight period leading to sunrise. All 3 religions, Jewish, Christian and Muslim, have prayers at both these times. And all 3 religions have different understandings of total darkness. For the Jews, it is totally dark if you can't recognize a face at 6 feet. For the Muslims, you are invited to dangle a length of white thread at arm's length. And if you can't make out the white thread in the dark, then it is totally dark. The Christians have a slightly less satisfactory understanding of total darkness. It is on retiring, by which they mean bedtime. And you then have to remember that we're talking about the days before almost anyone had artificial light. And when it got too dark to see, then bedtime was pretty much your only useful option. Well, we've now got 7 prayer times as required by Psalm 119. Is this the end of a story? Not quite. Psalm 119 has another trick up its sleeve. Verse 62, "At midnight I will rise to give thanks unto thee." And we might note that this is an extremely unusual example of the Bible having a precise time. Midnight is unambiguous in being a particular time of the night. Well, it may be hard work rising to give thanks at midnight, but at least it's easy to mark a midnight line in the diagram. It runs vertically upwards. And like its two neighbors, I've drawn this line, dotted or broken line, to indicate that the shadow of the gnomon will never fall on these lines because of the sun being below the horizon then. Well, we now have 8 times. And these are the times for prayer observed by the ancient Jews and by the early Christians. Now, I've already said that the Muslims pray 5 times a day, and I've mentioned that they are prohibited from praying at sunrise. Well, they're also wise enough not to say prayers at midnight. So that leaves us with 6 times. And for completeness, there are no set prayers for mid-morning for Muslims. Well, is this the pattern of prayer times adopted by Christians for all time? Well, sadly, no. Quite early on, someone calculated that the midnight office should actually be observed at the 8th hour of the night. That's 2 unequal hours after midnight, schematically like this. Now, I still simply cannot understand how you can interpret the unambiguous midnight as 2 hours after midnight. But then I realized that to this day, most people in the Northern Hemisphere are subject to legislation requiring them to observe midnight at 1 a.m., at least during the summer months. So maybe whoever did this calculation was an early advocate of double summer time. Well, I really ought to give names to these offices. Now, I've said before that at sunset, we have the office of Vespers, and the other 3 times are during the night are Compline, Matins, and Lauds. That's 4 of the times, and I can imagine some of you thinking Matins surely is a service said on Sunday mornings. Well, Matins, it has to be said, has moved around somewhat over the centuries, and it's also changed spellings. Sometimes it's spelled with a double T, and sometimes the I is changed to a Y. Take your pick. The other 4 times are all given names which relate to the nominal times at which they are observed. The sunrise office is called prime, the beginning of the 1st hour. The other 3 times are terce, sext, and none, after the Latin words for 3rd, 6th, and 9th. Now, it would be nice to think that this really did get set in stone forever and a day. Well, in some seriously pedantic sense, much of what you see here really does persist to this day. As recently, and I'm talking in historical terms, as recently as 1962 to 1965, the Second Vatican Council considered all this and confirmed all these offices, with the exception of the office of prime, which they suppressed. And intriguingly, Hippolytus didn't include prime in his list of offices. He had just 7. So maybe the Second Vatican Council was harking back to Hippolytus. It does seem less likely that they were following the pattern followed by Muslims. Now, it's all very well coming up with a pattern like this. It's quite a separate matter to expect people to adhere to it. Nevertheless, quite early on, many writers came up with this, use this as a kind of template as a way of life. Perhaps the best known example is the Rule of St. Benedict, written by St. Benedict. And he was not alone. There are other rules, the rule of St. Francis and others besides. St. Benedict is perhaps best known. He wrote 73 chapters in difficult to understand Latin, and different writers have interpreted St. Benedict in different ways, but all agree that he was very prescriptive. He didn't just specify these 8 offices and when they should be observed and all the prayers that should be said at these times, but he went on to say when you should eat, and importantly, when you should not eat, that is when you should fast, when you should sleep, when you should work, when you should rest, and even when you should change your clothes. And this rule was later followed by the Benedictine order, which incidentally was not founded by St. Benedict, but very much followed his rule. Other orders followed rules vaguely like St. Benedict. And to show you the kind of thing that happened by way of adapting the rules, let me tell you the story of a certain monastic order in North Germany. And they followed the rule that you should have breakfast at roughly the office of prime, but then you should fast until the office of noon. And between prime and noon, you should essentially work, although you were, of course, allowed 2 breaks for terce and sext. And it is possible that they were allowed to rest between sext and noon, but they weren't allowed to eat. Now, in winter, this is not too bad. The time between sunrise and mid-afternoon is not that long. But in high summer, this is something of an ordeal, and these monks simply couldn't take it. And so they decided that, well, the office of noon is assigned to the 9th hour. Why not say it in the middle of the 9th hour instead of at the end? And this eased their hunger pains a little. But you know how it is once you start bending rules, there's no knowing where it stops. And before long, they were observing the office of noon at the beginning of the 9th hour. And I regret to say this ill discipline eventually got quite out of hand, and in due course they were observing the office of noon at midday, displacing the office of sext to an earlier time and also the office of terce to an earlier time. And we end up with a pattern not unlike this. Terce has been displaced 1 hour early, sext 2 hours early, and noon 3 hours early, with no offices during the afternoon before vespers at sunset. And even worse, this lamentable behavior was copied in England. Now, is there any evidence for this? Well, yes, there is, by the introduction of a new word in the English language. The office of noon, you see, is named after the time when it should be observed, the 9th hour. But here we have the office of noon being observed at midday. And people got to know about this and came to associate midday with noon, which in due course got corrupted to noon. And that is how the word noon entered the English language, all ultimately as a result of ill-disciplined North German monks. Is there any other evidence? Well, perhaps, and here I'm going to be thoroughly speculative and show you a sundial on another historic church in Cambridgeshire at Hawkston. And you can see some convincing hour lines in the morning, but the rest of hour lines in the afternoon. And if you look at the morning, you can see a horizontal line for the office of prime. And then the next 2 hour lines are quite definitely at more like 30-degree intervals than 45-degree intervals. And the first of those lines is for the office of terce, displaced. The next one for the office of sext, displaced. And there is a very faint vertical line for the highly displaced office of noon. And we can see right at sunset a hard line, heavy line for the office of Vespers, and little in between. But some of you, I think, will be saying, wait a minute, I can see an hour line before sunset. And that's possible because it is said that some orders, perhaps to assuage their guilt, split the office of Vespers into two parts. You have a sort of Vespers part 1 and a Vespers part 2. So that could be what we are seeing here. Don't take this story too seriously, but it does go to show that when you see mass dials, they can be interpreted in all kinds of ways, much of it highly speculative. I'm going to show you another example. This is at Bythorn, west of Huntingdon. And this has hour lines going all around the circle. All those hour lines which are above the horizontal diameter are decidedly academic because they refer to times when the sun is below the horizon. I just want to draw your attention again to something I said earlier. The two 45-degree lines for mid-morning and mid-afternoon are not mathematically sound. And this bothered me. It bothered me so much that I wondered what to do about it. Now, it's no good simply moving the lines because the shadow of a horizontal sundial at mid-morning lands in various positions according to the time of year, likewise mid-afternoon. And it turns out that if you bend the gnomon downwards, you can do a rather better job. And cutting a long story short, I came up with a design which was implemented by a Swedish workshop in Scriptorum in 2010. And here it is on the south wall of the Rosalind Franklin building at Newnham College in Cambridge. And you can see it from the road. This is a memorial sundial to Margaret Stanier, who was a science fellow of the college and whom I knew quite well. And she was an enthusiast for mass dials. So it seemed appropriate to provide her with an upmarket mass dial as a memorial. And she was also a bell ringer. So I have provided her with a little bell to support the gnomon. You can actually see the bell shape better with the shadow than the bell itself. And you might notice that the gnomon is indeed not quite horizontal. For the latitude of Cambridge, it has to bend down at an angle of about 8.9 degrees. And at that angle, it turns out that the shadow at mid-morning is always very close to the hour line labeled 3 here. It wobbles around a bit, but not very much. And likewise, mid-afternoon, it's always on or very close to the hour line labeled 9. The other hour lines are slightly less satisfactory. The only really bad news is that it doesn't get sunrise and sunset right because I bent the gnomon downwards from the horizontal. So those hour lines have turned into wiggly rays of the sun. This seems a good place to end.
Well, thank you ever so much, Frank, for a fascinating talk. That's absolutely brilliant. And let's see what questions people have been asking. Right, chat.
May I ask a question whilst my husband is fiddling? I've been noticing in some reading I've been doing recently that there seem to be discrepancies of the period at which people start to use the 9th hour, noon, as noon as we understand it. What sort of date do you think that became common in England? Oh,
it was very early. Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, the well-known writer of the Canterbury Tales and other things, was also a well-known sundial enthusiast. And he wrote the very earliest treatise on the subject of astrolabes. And in this treatise, he certainly uses noon to mean midday. And Chaucer died in 1400, so it must have been before that. Moreover, you will find, of course, quite a lot after Chaucer, that noon appears in the King James version of the Bible, indeed, even in the Old Testament, where it's a delightful anachronism. But there it is. So very, very early on, I mean, I would say 600, 700, 800. So these monks got tired quite early, or got hungry quite early, and the habit was transported to England in the Dark Ages, what we call the Dark Ages, when in fact quite a lot actually went on.
Thank you very much.
John Wilson would also like to put an oral question. John, are you? Yes. Shall we unmute you? Ah.
You have to unmute yourself.
Can you unmute yourself, John?
Is that
right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Frank, you may remember that a few years ago, I showed a brief study that I had carried out on our local church at Lamley in Nottinghamshire.
I do indeed.
And I concluded from this that there were 3 hour lines roughly between your hours 3, 4 and 5, which worked out to the approximate time of sort of between 10:30 and 11 a.m. at the solstices and the equinoxes. I'm not sure whether this is how they worked them, but it certainly seemed to work at Lamley. And because I took a number of photographs, I also did a little experiment with a model of the mass style. Can you recall what I actually said on that? And would you like to comment? Can I also say that I've seen a number of other churches which have 3 lines in the same position?
Yes, that's not uncommon. You do indeed see fragments of mass dial where there's absolutely no evidence of the afternoon at all, not like the Hawkston dial, which I've just shown you, but it's essentially the bottom left-hand quadrant only, totally omitting anything else. And you might see, typically, as you say, 3 lines, sometimes a bit more, but often just 3. And my conjecture, I mean, people don't know, it's not documented anywhere, not in documentation anybody has seen, but it seems very likely these are not actually prayer times as much as event markers, perhaps when the market opened or something like that, but of no religious significance at all. But that's only early writers' conjecture. I have no evidence one way or another that I regard as hard.
A question from Susan Boness. She says, our church Yelling has a scratch dial which is divided into 20 sections, not 24. Why is this? Also, was the gnomon ever moved from the central hole for any reason? Our dial has several holes, which may of course be insect damage or vandalism, but they seem very carefully drilled.
Oh yes. Yes, I didn't mention that. You do find on some mass dials, you find holes all over the place. Nobody really knows why that is, but as your questioner asks or says, they're quite carefully done. So they're obviously deliberate and not done by vandals or insects. And we just don't know. Why there should be 20 hour lines rather than 24? Well, you saw how badly the one at Little St Mary's was drawn, and even that, it's arguable whether it's actually got 24. It's every time I count it, I come up with a different number. So it's not at all surprising that you will see some with 20, but they just drew lines at 2 horizontal lines, and then just got the angles wrong. They didn't use a protractor or anything useful. It was just very poor craftsmanship.
That's what Ian Ramsey said, yes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, almost every civilization that has ever thought about numbering time has used 24 hours altogether, 12 hours in the day, 12 hours at night. How they define sunrise and sunset varies considerably, but almost nobody has ever had a serious attempt at having other than 24 hours in a day, with the notable exception of Napoleon, who had a 10-hour day for French Revolutionary time, and that didn't last very long.
Yes, I think you really answered John Sturdy's question. Could the extra holes be to compensate for the equation of time? I think you really.
No, quite certainly not. They wouldn't have understood that in those days.
No, I know. Now, I think Diana James, before we started, mentioned the dial at Great Paxton. You're aware of that dial, aren't you? I think.
Well, I need reminding of the Great Paxton dial. I read about it the other day. It's gone clean out of my head. Senior moment.
Does she want to say anything
But
about it?
would Diana like to? Diane, sorry, I do beg your pardon. Would you like to say anything about that? I can. Can you unmute? Yeah.
Sorry, she's left the room. Graham, my husband. It's not very clear. There's only about 7 or 8 lines actually visible now. 6 are in 1/4 of it. We don't know the date of it, but it's on the north wall of the church, which some of which, of course, is Anglo-Saxon. But
Yes.
do you know when sundials when they first were used?
The sundials first used, the time of Adam. They've been going forever. They've changed character over the centuries. The ancient Babylonians had them, the Egyptians had them, the ancient Greeks had them. The Romans didn't really understand them. They just stole them from Greece. But the sort of sundials that I've been talking about, which includes your sort, where it's essentially on a stone, on a vertical stone, on a typical church wall, those date certainly pre-conquest, can break pre-conquest. They were being made right up till around 1600, of course, only furtively. Once the Reformation came in mid 16th century, these things went out of fashion, or they were covered up or not drawn attention to. So you can say it's certainly before 1550, but it could be anywhere from conquest times. Most Anglo-Saxon churches were actually essentially wooden shacks, and there is no trace of them, or very little trace of them to this day. When you do see Saxon stonework, which has survived, it's unusual. And if you see a sundial on a north-facing stone, it's almost certainly been moved. Any amount of rebuilding has taken place on churches, and I won't say you see sundials on the north walls of churches as often as you see them on the south, but you certainly see them more frequently than one has any right to. It's not a sensible place to put a sundial for obvious reasons. So it's probably a reused stone. It doesn't mean to say it didn't come from that church. That's why you sometimes see them upside down or the wrong way around, or all kinds of things. Just an abuse of somebody not knowing what was going on. And of course, the richer the place, the more unlikely it is that any sundials will have survived, because they wouldn't have survived rebuilding work. Obviously, in the city of Cambridge itself, there are undoubtedly many more sundials, mass dials on the churches. I think there was one on St. Benet's Church until the mid to late 19th century, but that got knocked down by building work. And so it's only the one on Little St. Mary's which has survived.
Frank, could I, well, be a bit unfair perhaps, because you may say it's outside your period, but the earliest mechanical clocks with a verge escapement had a very considerable scope for regulation, way beyond what would needed just to secure accuracy. Do you think this may have been done deliberately so that they could record solar rather than civil time?
You don't quite mean that. They used dies naturalis rather than dies civilis. And the answer, I think, is a very, very high chance of being yes. The arms on virgin folio escapements had weights, and you could pull the weights in, which would make the speed up the clock, and you move the weight out and it would slow the clock down. And given that these clocks were noted for not being terribly precise, they were adjusted twice a day, and you would employ a clockmaker or clock keeper, and the clock keeper, probably he would be one of the church staff, would be tasked with doing this, and he would every morning at sunrise he would see how it was doing, and note for the following night that he got the weights too far in or too far out, he would then adjust them for the daytime period. And there is archaeological evidence, remains of arms lying on floors underneath steeples, just saying winter, summer on them. So it's obvious that somebody is changing their thing on a twice daily basis. So that in the height of summer, where you want the thing to be very slow during the day, you would have the weights going right out to the outer ends of the arm. And then every night you have to bring them right in, so it go very fast during the night, because you want a factor of 2. In the latitude of Cambridge, an unequal hour in summer is just over, well, this time of year, in fact, is just over 16 hours, and the nighttime hour is just under 8 hours. So yes, I'm thoroughly convinced that the Virgin Folio clocks were used to indicate unequal hours, as I've called them.
Thanks very much. That's most interesting. Elfin asks, is there any kind of recording being made of scratch dials?
Yes, indeed. There are 50 churches I've come across in Cambridge which have got scratch dials on it. And I sent you and Graham a PDF, which I hope you would be sending to people, which lists the churches in Cambridgeshire which have mass dials on them. And some of them have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mass dials. So yes, 50 churches in Cambridge known to have mass dials, albeit some of them fragmentary.
That's absolutely brilliant, because one of the fundraising events that we run is the annual sponsored Ride and Stride, and we could sort of have a competition for people going around Cambridge, seeing how many of these they could spot. So,
that would be nice, because we don't have photographs of all of them, and if you can persuade people to write some notes and take a photograph of each one, there are only 50 to look at, and there must be one near you, so to speak, if you live in Cambridgeshire. Go and have a look at it, and let us know about it, because the records are not terribly good. But we know we have records of roughly, John Wilson will know better than I, but we have records of about 6,000 mass dials in England.
Oh, right.
So that's a large number. I mean, we reckon there are 10,000 medieval parishes in England, and 6,000 of the medieval parish churches have mass dials on them to this day.
Andrew from Great Paxton says the sundial is on a buttress on the south wall there.
That's exactly the right place to have it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
As is for one at Little St Mary's, that's on a south buttress too.
Yeah. Right. So they have not been moved in subsequent. Well, they haven't
been moved. Yes.
They haven't been moved to negate their usefulness. No.
Well, my apologies for the mistake.
No, that seems to be all the questions that we've got. It just remains for me to thank you, Frank, for such an absolutely brilliant presentation, and for so lucidly answering all these multifarious questions that people have come up with. That has been a most enjoyable evening. I'm sure everybody agrees. If any of you are not members, then please, I would ask again, consider joining and or make a donation in recognition of the good evening that you've had.
Promise to send
and I promise that we will make the PDF available. That's absolutely brilliant. So thank you everybody who's attended this evening. I'm sure you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and thank you again, Frank, for such a brilliant evening.
Well, thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Shall we express our